Welcome to our evening with Tom Emery. Tom is a historian who focuses mostly in Illinois, but he also does presidential history in general. He is also an author who has written books and writes for several newspapers in Illinois. Welcome, Tom, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Taylor. Good evening, everyone out there in virtual reality in Danville, the home of Ward Hill Lamon and a spot on the 8th Judicial Circuit of Lincoln. My name is Tom Emery. I'm a freelance writer and historical researcher from Carlinville, Illinois. And when I'm doing this in person, I always have to ask the audience, do you know where Carlinville is or know anything about it? So some of you may have some idea about it. We're 160 miles west of you. We're 45 miles south of Springfield. We're a town of about 5,200. I'm coming to you tonight from the Carlinville Public Library, where I'm on the board. I'm being joined tonight by our great director, Hannah Miller, who's off to the side here. She's my technical support because I really know hardly anything about Zoom. I've done several programs on Zoom. I still can't get used to it. So hopefully we can have talk about some interesting things tonight. You'll have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. And I'd be happy to answer those. Like I say, when I'm doing this in person, I'm happy to do that. This particular program is one that I debuted on November 10th, 2016 in Rock Island, Illinois. It originated from an article I'd done for one of my newspapers. I have had byline articles in over 150 newspapers in my career. I've done over 160 speaking engagements in the last decade. I usually do about 20 of these a year until, of course, COVID hit. So I don't get to do as many as I used to. And I'm still trying to get used to the Zoom format. But I'm happy to be here tonight. I really appreciate Taylor inviting me here. And this particular program is on presidential marriages and romances, like I say, which originated from an article that I did 7 or 8 years ago. This talks about a sometimes lesser known aspect of the American presidency, the marriages and romantic adventures of the men who have served as our chief executive. Sometimes presidents and first ladies aren't seen as humans. They're more like gods or figureheads, even in our American democracy. But they have personal lives that sometimes lead to marital bliss and sometimes to marital issues. The pressure of the presidency can lead to that. But sometimes it's personalities of the presidents themselves and their first ladies. They may share the same traits of ambition, leadership, civil service, but sometimes similarities were in there as it would for any group of people because they are different people. The marriages are different from president to president as well. You can't really generalize. We'll talk about that some tonight. So we're going to look at some of the highlights and lowlights of the marriages of the presidents. We'll look at some of the most famous, like Lincoln, who we'll start with tonight and talk about length, and some of the lesser known ones, because their stories are fascinating as well. I'm going to offer 2 disclaimers before I get going. One, I'm going to talk about past administrations rather than the recent ones, because you all remember the recent ones. I don't need to go into that for any of you. You remember what's happened in recent history, so I don't need to recap that. The other thing is I'm not going to be biased, talk about political affiliations or lean one way or the other. You're not going to get out of me how I vote. I'm not going to talk about that. I don't care how you vote either, frankly. That's one reason I want to talk about the recent ones, because everything is so polarizing. I laugh with my in-person audiences that I don't want to see fistfights in the libraries about this. And I don't want to try to blow up the internet tonight and shut everything down if I start talking about recent presidencies, because frankly, I don't think they're as interesting as some of the older ones. As I've talked to Taylor, you'll be able to ask some questions as we go along. And I'll stop every so often to see if you have any questions, and we'll be able to take some questions at the end of this. This usually runs about an hour. I usually end up trying to cut it short because it does usually run long. There's an awful lot of information. We're talking about close to 250 years of American presidencies. It's hard to boil it down into an hour, trust me. But I try to hit the most interesting ones, some of the interesting stories. And if you're worried about this, don't worry. I don't go over every president. I just kind of hit and miss. So let's talk about the president that almost everyone considers to be our greatest president, our most popular president. In my opinion, he does not have a close second. That is Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. Now, if I was meeting with you in person tonight, I would ask you what I ask my other audiences. When I mention the name Abraham Lincoln, what's the first thing you think of? And I can tell you what I usually get. That he was honest, tall is something I get quite often, that he served through the Civil War, was assassinated, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and sometimes some really good Lincoln readers would just pipe up something like he was a postmaster or a surveyor, or some different things like that. I hear he has a beard quite a bit. So I really get a kick out of the things that people tell me about Lincoln. It just pops into their head. But they're always positive. Keep that in mind, they're always positive. Then I say to the audience, If I was to ask you the first thing you think of when I mention the name Mary Todd Lincoln, I bet it's not as positive. And that's unfortunate because she's been much maligned in our history. She remains a very divisive figure among Lincoln scholars and researchers like myself today. But I'm going to make no bones about this. I'm a historian. I'm supposed to be unbiased, but again, I make no pretenses. I love Mary Todd Lincoln. I find her endlessly fascinating. I could talk about her. I could talk about her till midnight. I could bore you all to tears and be in bed by the time I'm done, because I wouldn't be done then. I just love Mary Todd Lincoln. She's a fascinating individual, a very polarizing one, but very fascinating. Because of her good traits, she was well-read, well-spoken, well-mannered, politically astute woman who was highly maternal and deeply loved her children, just loved children in general. Incredible research proves this. Now, was she perfect? God, no. She had plenty of faults, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on as well. Like I say, she's a very divisive figure among scholars. Some of the people that I'm around most in the Springfield, Laconia community, people I talk to that research Lincoln, they will give you different opinions as well. Some of my closest friends in the Lincoln community, Springfield, have different opinions of Mary Todd. She's a very divisive figure. She was way ahead of her time. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 1850s, 1860s. Women weren't supposed to have minds at this time. She was a good match for Lincoln from an intellectual standpoint. She shared his ambition. Like several other first ladies, she tried to be versed in policy, or at least thought she was, and tried to advise him. She tried to take an active role. One thing that really hurt Mary Todd Lincoln then and now is people didn't understand mental illness. There's something I laughed about with my audiences. Nowadays, some people, particularly if you're a celebrity and you have mental illness, you kind of get a free pass. And I break people up when I say this when I'm talking to them in person. I hope you feel the same way. Think about the celebrities that get the most press, that hear about the most on cable news, most on the internet over the last decade or so. Charlie Sheen, Lindsay Lohan, Michael Vick. These people are nuts. They really are. But they get the most publicity, and people seem to either love them for it or can't get enough of hearing about it. It wasn't really that case for Mary Todd 150 some years ago. People did not understand mental illness. She is believed now to be manic depressive. There have been very conclusive studies, in my estimation, about Mary Todd's mental state, particularly one that came out in 2012, an essay from a professor at Cal Santa Barbara, I believe it was, made a very compelling case that Mary Lincoln suffered from bipolar disorder. And she certainly showed many of the traits. I've studied manic depression as part of in my life as some of the things I've done. And I believe that to be true as well. Mental illness actually ran in Mary Todd's family. What a lot of people don't realize is that as many as 14 of her relatives were in asylums. She had one brother who suffered from depression, another who died in an insane asylum. So it was inherited in many ways. She was from one of the top families of Lexington, Kentucky. Her father's a banker, a merchant, a lawyer, one of the very prominent families of Lexington high society. Her parents were second cousins, and her maternal grandparents were first cousins. Now think about that. It was not unusual for Southern families, particularly of position, to inbreed, so to speak. But it really skews the gene pool. And I thought something else that hurt Mary Todd. So really, when she was born, she had a number of things working against her for all of her privilege. She was one of 6 children. Her mother died, then her father remarried. There were 8 half siblings to deal with as well. She had a very rocky relationship with her stepmother. Did not really have a happy home life. She referred to her childhood as desolate. And I think that's a stretch. I think that was an exaggeration. And she did have a tendency to exaggerate, but it was clearly not a happy situation for her. As she aged, she was a Southerner, and she caught a lot of flack for that, certainly in the Civil War. She had relatives who fought for the Confederacy. She had at least 5 relatives who were fighting for the Confederacy, including a half-brother, Benjamin Hart Helm, who was a Confederate brigadier general who died at the Battle of Chickamauga, was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. She happened to go on the bad side of a number of people of influence. That doesn't help your public relations. And she was prone to severe outbursts in public, particularly as she went along in the White House and after her time in the White House. They're very embarrassing episodes and were to her detriment, and she regretted that. She wasn't a monster. She knew when she was wrong. She tried to make it up to people. She'd send them gifts. She tried to apologize. She was not a monster. She knew when she was wrong. But she had a number of these outbursts which were in many ways caused by her high-strung nature and her mental illness. Her spending habits were completely out of control. They were through the White House and her past White House years. I'll give you two examples. In 1861, right after they came to Washington, Congress appropriated $20,000 for her to redo the White House. And I think about $20,000 in 1861, that's a lot of money. And she couldn't handle that. She blew that away by $6,700. So she exceeded that by quite a ways. One reason that she was very worried that her husband, Lincoln, would not be reelected in 1864, in addition to the fact she believed in him so strongly, his leadership, his values, what he was doing for the country, is that she knew if he was not elected, then her heavy spending debts would be revealed that she'd racked up over the years to the tune of $27,000. Let's figure what that might be in 1864 terms. She spent heavily. She was the ultimate compulsive shopper, and that really showed up later in her life. She might buy 50 pairs of gloves. This, was very much a compulsive shopper. It is in line with manic depression. She was highly outspoken, had a firecracker temper, I mentioned. She was given a very deep, severe mourning. Mourning really defined her life. Mourning was kind of an art form in the post-Civil War Victorian era, and Mary Lincoln really carried that to extremes. She dressed in black for the rest of her life after he was assassinated. She did everything in a big way. Whether if she loved someone, she about smothered them. If she didn't like someone, she was furious at them. Like say, mourning was done in excess. Again, these are traits of manic depression. Her emotional state deteriorated after Lincoln's death, and she was found insane in May of 1875 in a highly controversial episode. She was a tragic figure who lost 3 of her 4 children in her life. She had her husband shot sitting next to her. She's a much maligned figure in American history, and I think there's a phrase that I refer back to, and I do about three or four different programs where I focus on Lincoln, 2 or 3 where I talk about Lincoln exclusively, and I talk about Lincoln quite a bit and some others. I look back on a phrase that was written in 1969 by a lady from Springfield named Dorothy Cashman, whose husband George was a curate of the Lincoln tomb for years and years and years. Mrs. Cashman said, and I quote, "The blackest spot in our American history is the way that Mary Todd Lincoln has been treated." I think it's very poignant. I think it's very accurate. People feel the need to hate Mary Lincoln. People don't just hate Mary, they almost revel in hating Mary. If you talk to the haters of Mary Todd Lincoln, it's almost like they love doing it. They just love to hate. Everybody loves Abraham Lincoln. Very few people don't. I don't know why they can't love or at least respect both of them. Keep in mind, if she was that bad, he married her. And if he's wonderful, well, what does that say? But the thing I'd want you to take away from this tonight, and I say this to my other audience as well, that too much has been made of Mary Todd Lincoln's bad points and not enough has been made of her good points. That's something I just want you to take away from this tonight if you can. So if you have questions, post them. I'd be happy to take them. Like I say, Taylor said we could do this through the talk. If not, I can go on. If you have any questions, just let me know. We have Hannah here ready to help me out if we need to as well. So
looks like we don't have any questions at the moment.
So go on.
Yep.
Very well. Very good. We're going to Lincoln's other loves or lack thereof. And that starts with Anne Rutledge. Now, if I was seeing it all of you tonight, first thing I'd want to know is how many of you have heard of the story of Anne Rutledge? And I would hope most of you have not, because that would be fresh fish for me. And I laugh about that. One of my audiences I had in Missouri 4 years ago, those people did not know who Anne Rutledge was. So I was able to tell them, and that was a really fun experience for me. Anne Rutledge was a 19-year-old girl that Lincoln met when he lived at New Salem, the log cabin village 20 miles north of Springfield near Petersburg, Illinois. He lived there from 1831 to 1837. She was a daughter of the local tavern owner, and which where Lincoln boarded. And when I say tavern, taverns in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, the 19th century had a much different meaning than we know them today. Today, a tavern is a place where you go to drink, and I don't drink, so I'm not in them at all. But for taverns back then, it was a much different term. People drank there, but they also lodged there, like Lincoln. They boarded there. People ate meals there. There were meeting houses. You might have school meetings, political meetings, voting, what have you. It was really center of the town. And it was really the kind of the anchor of these little communities, such as New Salem. So Lincoln is staying in the tavern owned by Anne Rutledge's father in a town of 100 people. they've met. Whether they knew each other is not the question. How well they knew each other and whether they were romantically involved is something that Lincoln scholars have debated literally since Lincoln died. According to the legend, and I say the legend because this is how the story has gone at times, particularly in the mid-19th century, early mid-19th century. Supposedly, and I'll say this first off, keep in mind that Anne Rutledge is engaged to another man. This is proven, that much we know. John McNeill, also went by John McNamara. It's a whole nother story in its own. But she's engaged to another man, okay? But supposedly an intense romance develops between Lincoln and Anne Rutledge. And when I say intense romance, I'm going to the legend. I keep using that word supposedly. It was not just a romance or a deep one. It was something that we mere mortals cannot understand. It was like Adam and Eve, Romeo and Juliet, something that we mere mortals just cannot comprehend, something that's just transcendent. Unfortunately, Anne died tragically in 1835 of illness. Supposedly, here's that word again, Lincoln is despondent. He throws himself on her grave, sobbing uncontrollably, vows he can never love another woman. His friends are worried that he will do away with himself. He is in such agony. According to the legend, Lincoln never loved another woman, knew he never could, and never did. But it doesn't stop there. The memory of Anne Rutledge, this lost girl from New Salem, was so great, it actually drove him for the rest of his life, drove him to the heights that he achieved, and was affecting the decisions he made in the White House through the Civil War. Take a minute to think about that one. I do it with my audiences in person, and doesn't that just sound nuts to you? I mean, really. But that is how the Anne Rutledge myth became this enormous take on life of its own being. And it really remains in some ways this day. Here are the facts. There is no definitive proof that Abraham Lincoln ever loved Anne Rutledge. No letters between the two exist. There are no letters between the two exist. No pictures of Anne exist. She died for a photography hit Central Illinois. There's no definitive proof that Lincoln ever mentioned her name. The only settler that later said Lincoln mentioned Anne's name to him, that has been debunked by most credible scholars. New Salem settlers, when were interviewed after the Civil War, after Lincoln's death, were quite divided on whether there's even a romance at all. And we'll touch on that a little bit. We're going to talk about that's going to be a talking point here a little later on. Anne Rutledge was actually not even living in New Salem when she died. Her family had moved to a point called Sand Ridge, which is 7 miles from New Salem and Petersburg. So the fact that she was buried, that's where she's buried to begin with. So the idea of Lincoln throwing himself on her grave would have been 7-mile ride on horseback. Again, think about that one. That throws a whole new spin on it. Lincoln was likely preoccupied with a lot of different things. He was in the legislature at the time. He was in his first and fourth straight term of the state legislature. He worked several different jobs. He was New Salem postmaster. He was in surveying. So he was quite busy at the time. Scholars today remain divided on the Anne Rutledge myth, or the Anne Rutledge story. The story has its roots in a very vague reference in a Petersburg newspaper on February 15th, 1862, that Lincoln may have had some type of relationship with a woman from New Salem. But the story really got its feet from the writings of William Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner, his third law partner from 1844 to 1860. Herndon wrote a book about Lincoln after the Civil War, and it's been debunked by many scholars. It remains kind of a controversial source in Lincoln studies today. It has some good points in it, but many things Herndon wrote just simply aren't true or interpreted in such a strange way you can't take them seriously. This is accepted. William Herndon was an alcoholic, was motivated by money, and hated Mary Todd. She hated him right back. Think about this. She never entertained him, never had him in the Lincoln home. Can you imagine not having your husband's law partner in your house? That just, is almost inconceivable. Some people believe that the book and the Anne Rutledge myth, the Anne Rutledge story, was Herndon's way of getting even with Mary Todd, and he succeeded, because that story gained traction and remains this day, and it damaged one of the many things that damaged Mary Todd's national reputation. The idea of Lincoln in love with a simple country girl captured the imagination of the nation, coupled with the lingering negative perceptions of Mary, who had a number of controversies and scandalous stories, not really bad behavior, but were negative stories about her written after the war. The Anne Rutledge myth has come and gone over the years. Scholars swing back and forth on it. The story was conclusively debunked in the mid-1940s by James Randall, who was at the University of Illinois and is considered the premier Lincoln scholar of all time. Dr. Randall is a towering figure in Lincoln research. The Randall tree of people that he mentored and taught, such as Dr. Wayne Temple, who's my professional idol, David Herbert Donald, who wrote a wonderful book on Lincoln in 1995, was extremely well thought of. The Randall tree continues today. Randall is just, for all of you Illinois grads out there, I know you're not too far from U of I, that he just towers over Lincoln researchers today. But he did not believe in the Anne Rutledge myth. It goes back and forth. In the 1990s, Douglas Wilson, who's professor at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, went back to the original research that Herndon did, some of the interviews he'd done for New Salem settlers, reanalyzed the evidence, included that yes, there had been a relationship between Lincoln and Anne Rutledge. So again, it goes back and forth and comes and goes. I personally do not believe there was a relationship. I think there's too many things to say there weren't. And we'll talk about a few of those in a little while. But I think the thing that most scholars agree on today, that if there was a relationship, it did not have an encompassing effect on Lincoln's life. And I think that's more palatable. This idea of it being this Adam and Eve style romance is just completely outlandish. But the Anne Rutledge myth continues today. For those of you familiar with Springfield, you might remember the Anne Rutledge Pancake House, which was on North Grand in Springfield in the 1970s, 1980s. We here in Carlinville, we're on the Amtrak corridor. For many years, on the Chicago and Alton, the predecessor of Amtrak, as well as the Amtrak now. The Anne Rutledge was a train between St. Louis and Chicago. So Anne Rutledge lives on today, even though Mary Todd Lincoln's reputation is starting to, the winds are changing in her favor, because the more I talk to people, the more I do these talks, the more I see that people are becoming more and more sympathetic. Harold Holzer, one of the premier Lincoln scholars of today, is very sympathetic toward her. A number of writers have become more sympathetic. So the winds are changing in Mary Todd's favor, but still is kind of a problem. I do want to mention too, I mentioned the U of I. I'm wearing the little pin here is for Illinois State University. I want to give a plug to the ISU community. I created a book in 2020 on Abraham Lincoln's connections to Illinois State University. He helped found that university and had the fabric of ISU is part of Abraham Lincoln as well. So I wanted to point out that I'm an Illinois State person. I'm very proud of that. So if you have any questions, Taylor, if you do, if not, I'll move on. Hannah's an Illinois State grad here. She's smiling as I say that.
Yeah.
I am a UIUC grad, so.
UIUC, really? Okay. I was actually born in Urbana. I was born at Carl Hospital. Yep. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can either ask them now or pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we can move on.
I'll go on. We mentioned someone that we think that people think Lincoln had a relationship with, not we, I don't, but people think Lincoln had a relationship with. But I'm talking about someone we know Lincoln had a relationship with before his marriage, and that was Mary Owens. He was involved with Mary Owens just months after Anne Rutledge's death. Think about that for a second. He's so despondent over Anne Rutledge, but he's dating someone else just a few months later, just not too long later. I think that in its own right kind of blows the Anne Rutledge theory out of the water. Now, I should mention too, the farm where Anne Rutledge's family were living, that was owned by Anne Rutledge's fiance. So I think that's another thing too. But let's go back to Mary Owens. At least 3 letters between Lincoln and Mary Owens exist. He had met her while she was visiting her sister in New Salem. She was from Kentucky, and she was up in New Salem visiting her sister. Lincoln got to know her a little bit. He was friends with her sister at New Salem, and he kind of laughed one time to his sister, "Yeah, if you bring Mary back, I'll marry her." Kind of laughed. It may have been a joke. Mary was actually a well-educated, reasonably attractive young woman. However, Lincoln wrote once of her, and I'm quoting, that he described her want of teeth, weather-beaten appearance in general. Nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in less than 35 or 40 years. He wrote that letter on April Fool's Day, so he might have been joking. We hope he was, at any rate. Once Mary Owens remembered that Lincoln and her were riding with some friends, and they came upon what she called a bad branch of water. She remembered the other men helped their women across, but Lincoln never even looked back for her. She ended up Mary, she lived in Western Missouri, a little town called Weston, Missouri, and at least two of her sons fought for the Confederacy. She apparently had no regrets about not marrying the President of the United States, because she said later that, quote, Lincoln was deficient in those little links which make up the chain of a woman's happiness. At least was so in my case. So she didn't even look back on that at all. Lincoln and his friends all talked about how awkward he was around women. He didn't know what to say, what to do, or how to act. Everyone who knew him best talked about that. And that kind of leads into his marriage as well, because he's very awkward around the lady he married, Mary Todd. How they met was when Lincoln was in Springfield. Mary Todd was from Kentucky, but she was living with her sister, Elizabeth Edwards. Four Todd girls ended up in Springfield. Mary was one of the belles of Springfield society. At a dance one evening, at a ball, Lincoln walked up to Mary and said, Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way. One of her friends later asked Mary, how was it? Was it the worst way? She remembered how he had stepped on her feet all evening, had scuffed up her dancing slippers, and she said, yes, he did dance with me the very worst way. And such began a very intense courtship, a very rocky courtship, which ended in marriage, which resulted in their marriage. And a lot has been made of the Lincoln marriage. It's been misunderstood. It seems like everyone has an agenda to talk about the marriage. Many writers, such as the controversial Herndon, as I mentioned, seem bent on making their lives miserable. And some of this goes back to negative perceptions of Mary and still the lingering feeling for Anne Rutledge. Again, this is a debate. This is a point of debate among Lincoln scholars, and scholars have varying attitudes of it. My take on it is our marriage was much closer than many realize, and those who knew the Lincolns best confirm that. One Civil War telegraph operator who saw everything going over the wires when Lincoln and Mary were apart through the war, through the White House years, said that Lincoln, quote, at all times showed most tender regard for his wife in the telegraphs. One colleague from the law circuit, which you all know from Danville being on the 8th Judicial Circuit, said that, quote, Lincoln thoroughly loved his wife. David Davis, who managed Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign, was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by Lincoln in 1862. And he had ridden the circuit with Lincoln as well, said, quote, Lincoln speaks very affectionately of his wife and children. It's very significant because David Davis hated Mary Todd Lincoln, despised the woman, and made no bones about it. Emily Todd, who was a half sister of Mary, said in 1855 that all she could see was complete harmony and loving kindness between Abraham and Mary. One neighbor boy from Springfield said Lincoln's home life was happiness and content, as far as I could ever know. He seemed to idolize his wife and boys, and they one all loved him. When they're apart, there's very much their letters have a very lover-like longing quality when they're apart. People said they're together, they're flirtatious, very playful. He called her Molly, sometimes mother or Mrs. Lincoln. Sometimes he referred as my child bride, which many women would take as an insult. But she really enjoyed that. She was 9 years younger than he was. He was a husband, father, lover. He was everything to her. The problems in the White House put a strain on the marriage because he was preoccupied with the war. The loss of their third child, Willie, on February 20th, 1862, made her despondent and him as well. She later recalled that on the day he died, the day he was shot, he died the next day. They took a carriage ride, and they was talking about how unhappy the time had been in Washington and how they looked forward to returning to Illinois in better times, or happier times that they had known before. She had several Southern relatives, including Helm, which put a strain on the marriage to a point as well, because some of them lived in the White House. We talked about how hard she was to live with, but he wasn't easy to live with either. He could be moody, withdrawn, subject to melancholy. A number of writers have made very compelling cases that Lincoln himself was suffered from depression. I believe that may be true. He didn't always have good manners. He could tell some, very coarse jokes. He's rough around the edges, and he was never home. We talked about him learning the legal circuit, as you all know in Danville. I've talked about some tonight. That was months at a time, twice a year. Keep in mind, he was also away for political talks, political speeches, what have you, whatever else he was doing. In the early 1850s, Lincoln was actually away from home 175 to 180 days a year. He admitted, I quote, I'm gone from home more than half my time. So he's gone a lot from home. A lot of people don't realize that or remember that. But he isn't in Springfield much, and he isn't home. It's not really the best situation for Mary to be in. Lincoln lived comfortably. Keep in mind that his oldest son went to Harvard, if that tells you anything. So Lincoln was doing quite well. He made quite a bit of money, although he was not materialistic. He made a fair amount of money. He lived comfortably. But still stepped down from her Lexington high society. She's afraid of prowlers. She's afraid of thunderstorms. He would leave the office in Springfield if a storm was coming because she needed him, and he knew that. He was very patient with her, very patient with her outbursts, very patient with her moods. He was very patient, very loving with her. He took a very active role in child rearing, which was not done in the 1840s and 1850s. Many people would say how much time he spent with the boys. One lady, and I thought this was such a great image to see, would say that she could still see him years later, remembering how he would be walking in the street with one arm pushing a baby carriage, and the other with a book in his hand, reading as he pushed. Think about how that would look. That's just a marvelous thing to say. I'd love to see that. I think we all would have. Did they fight? Well, yeah, they were married. Married people fight. I'm single. I don't have to put up with that. But all of you who are married know that it can be difficult at times. It doesn't mean you don't love each other, but you can still have some issues. A lot's been made of their quarrels, and I've guessed a few more severe, but I think it seemed to be an exception to the rule. There's sure plenty of evidence to say that he was happy at home. She was politically astute, intellectual, highly ambitious. They are a very good match. Their courtship is stormy. They go together for a while, they break up, they be depressed when they weren't together, they missed each other. And one of the most notable breakups on the 1st of January, New Year's Day, 1841, which he called the fatal 1st of January, when the courtship was broken, and it made him, and I'm quoting him, the most miserable man living. They were miserable when they were apart. She deeply loved him, and I don't think it's a question he loved her as well. She married down. Her family didn't approve. They thought he was beneath her, but who ended up being president? So she had the last laugh, and trust me, she was not above letting him know about it. And something I do think is, I do want to mention as we sign off on the Lincolns, many people say that there's no way that he could have loved Mary Todd because of the Anne Rutledge thing. That's just not fair. If I was going to tap all of you listening out there with truth serum, I'm guessing a lot of you did not marry the first person you fell in love with. I've been in love 3, maybe 4 times in my life. If I got married tomorrow, it just would not be fair to say that I could not love my wife. That's just not fair. If I look at the women or girls who came before and said, well, I just couldn't love my wife, that's not fair. That's not fair to Mary Todd either. I think he did love her. I don't think the Anne Rutledge thing existed. But even if it did, what does that say that he couldn't have been a good husband and loving husband and loving father? That just doesn't ring true. We know what a loving father he was, and he loved his wife as well. We're going to move on to another president, and be one that some of you are more familiar with, one of the most popular presidents, and usually one who ranks in the top 10 in presidential rankings, Harry Truman, who I think is quite a family man. I think one of the neater presidential families, one of the most fun presidential marriages there was. And I'm going to diverge a little bit here because I think it says something for the presidency, for Truman as well. Truman ascended the presidency after the death of the previous president, FDR. He was one of 8 presidents. We've lost 8 presidents in our history, 4 by assassination, 4 by illness. On April 12th, 1945, Harry Truman was having a drink in Sam Rayburn's Senate office. He was the vice president. He's sitting with Sam Rayburn in Rayburn's Senate office having a drink when he receives word to come to the White House. He does, and Eleanor Roosevelt greets him with the news, the president is dead. Truman says, is there anything I can do for you? To which Eleanor responds, is there anything that we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now. And that is a great presidential moment. I wish I'd been on the fly on the wall to have heard. That is just something to see, because I would love to have heard that. Harry Truman was married to Bess, his longtime and much beloved wife, one of the more popular first ladies then and now. One of the sources I used to prepare for this the program, I put this together in 2016, said, and I quote, that Bess would fit in perfectly well with the shoppers at the A&P. She's very unassuming, very plain, very down to earth, and very likable. That she would fit in perfectly well with the shoppers at the A&P, I think is a neat statement. In my estimation, and other people's, well, Harry and Bess had one of the stronger marriages in presidential history. Harry Truman said one time, I had only one sweetheart since the time I was 6, and that was Bess. Even though it took him a long time to get married. They did not marry until he was 35 and she was 34. They only had one daughter, Margaret, and we'll talk about her a little later. They lived for most of their time in Blair House, across the street since the White House being renovated. They didn't spend much of the presidency in the White House. Harry once said of Bess that she sat behind me in 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And I thought she was the most beautiful and the sweetest person on earth. And I'm still of that opinion after 26 years of being married to her. I'm old-fashioned, I guess. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. That's a great story. At a post-war conference in Germany, an Army officer offered to get Truman anything, like women. And we have some women brought in the president. Harry snapped, "Listen, son, I married my sweetheart. She doesn't run around on me and I don't run around on her. I want that understood. Don't you ever mention that kind of thing to me again." Many presidents are reportedly had affairs, and we'll talk about a few of them later on. Harry Truman is one of the few that you just don't hear a lot of those rumors about. I think he was quite the family man. They did things together as family. One time, White House staff remembered that that Harry, Bess, and Margaret had dinner with watermelon and threw seeds at each other. They'd feed squirrels under the table and the outside for lunch. There's a real informality there and a real closeness and a real camaraderie with that family. Margaret Truman is a writer and she's been a touring singer, but she received a horrible review after one performance in 1950. Harry was furious about this. He sits down and writes the reviewer, calling him, quote, "a frustrated old man who never made a success. I never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below." I think the man was 34 years old who wrote that review, but that says how loyal Harry was to his own. He lived to be old. He died on the day after Christmas, 1972, at the age of 88. She died in 1982 at the age of 97. I live in the St. Louis TV market. I remember when I was a little kid hearing about Bess Truman all the time, and I was just kind of fascinated with it. But she died at the age of 97. She was the longest living first lady. If you've been to the Harry Truman home in Independence, Missouri, that's something to see. That's just a remarkably simple home. It's not a mansion at all. It's two-story white frame house. Very comfortable, very lived in, really, really good feeling when you're there. If you get a chance, please do it. And the Presidential Museum in Independence of Truman's is really something to see too. One thing's interesting about Harry Truman after he left office, things are different for presidential retirements. And now all presidents make millions. They have some cause. They build the presidential library. They write the memoirs, deliver speeches. It's boring, I think. But I've written about presidential retirements, and past presidential retirements were a lot more interesting than today. Harry Truman, unlike me now, didn't have Social Security, a pension, Secret Service, or secretaries or anything. He went back to live a civilian life. For a while, the former president Truman was living on his Army pension alone of $112.66 a month. So money was an issue for Truman for a while. He later wrote his memoirs and made a lot of money, but I think that just kind of says the type of life he led and the way they were. Not all presidents, though, came into the White House with a wife. We'll talk about some of those a little later. Taylor and I were discussing this back and forth before you all came on the air tonight. Several presidents lost their wives before they went into the White House. Thomas Jefferson is one. His wife died in 1782 before he was inaugurated in 1801. The 38-year affair that he had with Sally Hemings, the slave, that was after his wife died. So there's nothing extramarital about that. He wasn't stepping out on his wife over that. And it is rumored and has been widely reported that Sally Hemings may have been his wife's half sister, based on the dalliances of white masters at the time. But the Sally Hemings 38-year affair was after Jefferson's wife had died. Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel, died the December after he was elected, just a few weeks after he was elected in 1828. They were married in 1791, or both were 24. She did smoke a pipe. That is true. She smoked a corncob pipe. She, though, was not legally divorced from her previous marriage. Her previous husband seemed rather disturbed, was insanely jealous for and sent her away from the household, go back to live with her parents. As a lawyer, Jefferson should have realized this based on some of the papers that have been filed. The divorce was not final with her first husband. Apparently he didn't. He married Rachel. only to realize later on that they were living in bigamy because the divorce was not finalized. That became an issue in the 1828 campaign. She was barely attacked, as was he. When she died, he made a comment, something effective, I can forgive them for what they've said about me, but for what they said about that, what my enemy said about her, only God can judge them, because he never forgave them for it and was very bitter for many years. Martin Van Buren's wife died in 1819. So he was a widow for most of his time as well. He was Jackson's vice president. And even though Jackson was a ruffian from Tennessee, there's many people thought of him as very rough around the edges. And Van Buren from Western New York was very stodgy and rather dowdy. I guess they formed a kind of a bond because Jackson, in his view, knew that Van Buren had lost his wife and he understood. So it was kind of an unlikely friendship. James Buchanan, the 15th president, never married. His niece, Harriet Lane, served as first lady through most of his term. Chester A. Arthur's wife died in January of 1880 before he was assumed the presidency on Garfield's assassination on September 20th, 1881. Arthur never remarried. And Jefferson didn't either, as I mentioned as a point. Arthur never remarried and had fresh flowers put on by a portrait of his wife daily in the White House. So really never got over that loss. I'm going to touch on something about presidential children, direct descendants. There are several presidents that have no direct descendants today, and I always go back to Lincoln. The last direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln died on Christmas Eve, 1985. There are a number of people that rightfully claim that they are descendants of Lincoln based on his cousins or how many cousins once removed. A lot of those go back to the Nancy Hanks connection, Lincoln's birth mother. Anyone tells you they are a direct descendant of Abraham Lincoln is lying to you. There are no direct descendants. That is not alone among presidents. Washington has no direct descendants because he never fathered any children. When he married Martha, she brought 2 children in the marriage. Same thing with James Madison. Dolly brought a son into the marriage. He was a spendthrift, and he very much spent her in oblivion after the president's death. Andrew Jackson never fathered any children. He adopted 1 or 2. Millard Fillmore's children never had any children of their own, died childless. He is without this direct sense, as is Franklin Pierce. They lost a child right before they assumed the White House. He has no direct sense. Of course, Buchanan never married, so that goes without saying. Arthur, his children died. He produced 1 grandchild who was childless when they died. William McKinley had 2 children who died young. So a number of presidents have no direct descendants today. That is not uncommon in presidential lineage. By comparison, John Tyler, who served from 1841 to 1845, fathered 14 children who lived to maturity by his 2 wives. He's married twice. He was fathering children at the age of 70. Some of them fathered children late in life, and they are near the same age. There's actually 1 grandchild of John Tyler that exists today, lives in Virginia. He's in his 90s. Even though Tyler, his grandfather, has not been in office since 1845. If that doesn't make you sick, I don't know what does, because John Tyler was one of the most mediocre presidents we ever had. We don't have Washington. We don't have Lincoln. We got John Tyler. That just makes you sick, really. He had another grandchild who died just 2 years ago. So the Tyler lineage goes on, direct lineage goes on for better or worse. Taylor, we have any questions before I go on? We'll talk about presidential affairs, and that gets a little interesting. Everyone hanging with us here tonight?
Not for this section. I think we're good.
Okay. We're good? Okay. I've got Hannah. She's looking at the presidential affairs. She wants to hear this too. A number of presidents had affairs, extramarital relationships before and during the presidency. Kennedy and Clinton are the 2 best known examples of that. And there are plenty of others. I'm talking about some of the lesser known ones. James Garfield, who served for only 200 days because he was shot on July 2nd, 1881, died on September 19th of that year. Excuse me. Before the war, he'd become involved with a woman in New York, which he ascribed to lawless passion. I like that phrase, lawless passion. I'm not sure what that means. As compared to lawful passion, I don't know what we're talking about here, but he called it lawless passion. He apologized to his wife and she forgave him. The interesting thing about that is, I've talked to people at some of my discussions who are Garfield fans, you'd be surprised the number of people that seem interested in Garfield. At least the few people that read about him are very loyal. Will tell you they believe him to be one of the more Christian presidents we ever had. And I think that's interesting. He still stepped out of the marriage. The worst, though, is Warren G. Harding. Served from 1921 till his death on August 2nd, 1923. Harding is considered by some the worst president in our American history. His term was rocked by scandal. And scandal of different types. Let's just put it that way. Harding was described as a handsome man, had a good personality, but I've read this phrase about him several times. He was not intellectual. And those are two words I've read several times about Harding, not intellectual. Maybe there's a theme here. He'd run a newspaper back home in Marion, Ohio, and he'd been a U.S. senator. He was married to a divorcee named Florence Harding. He called it Florence, he called her Flossie. She was 5 years older than he was. We've had two presidents, Reagan and Trump, who were divorced before the White House. We actually had several first ladies who were either divorced or had lost husbands before marrying the president living in the White House. So several first ladies have been married multiple times, either by divorce or by death. She was one of them. Flossie Harding is described as headstrong and bossy. She referred to him as Warren. It wasn't Warren, she was Warren. Warren? She always pronounced his name like that. It was quite a loveless marriage. Maybe there's reason for that, because it turns out he is carrying on not one, but two affairs at the same time before the White House. The first was with Carrie Phillips. Carrie Phillips and her husband Jim were friends of the Hardings. The foursome ran around together a lot. They'd go out to eat together. They took trips together, back and forth to each other's houses. Just one of friends among couples. Florence, at one point in 1905, had a kidney ailment. She's in the hospital. And apparently Jim Phelps is in a sanitarium, and I quote, soothing his nerves. What better time to start an affair? And that's what exactly happened with Warren Harding and Carrie Phillips. They began with both their spouses in hospitals. They began an intermittent affair of 15 years. It was an interesting match, to say the least. Carrie often clashed with Harding on policy. She favored the Kaiser of Germany, for example, where he and many Americans did not. Sometimes she would try to call his bluff, say, well, I'll expose our affair if you don't vote a certain way. And he just called her bluff, or what have you. So it was a strange back and forth. What makes their relationship, I'd say interesting, but that's too good of a word. In 2014, dozens of love letters between Carrie Phillips and Harding were released to the public. And I'm going to tell you this, folks, if I told you what was in those, or if I read those to you, that would end the discussion right now, because Hannah would throw me out of the library. She would just shut this whole thing down. Taylor would shut me off right now. Danville would be in all sorts of trouble. The internet would just blow up all over the place, because those things are R-rated. Those are highly graphic, very sexual in nature, and very descriptive. They're filthy, truthfully. They're just raunchy. People kind of smirked around when they came out in 2014. They're just kind of sickening. They're so raunchy. And I tell people, if you want to look them up, you're on your own on that. Because I'm not going to go into them. I've done this program, like I said, a number of different times. In April of 2017, I was doing this in Orland Park, which is a beautiful library in the South Chicago suburbs. And I was mentioning this. I had 40 people in the audience that night. 36 of them were women. And I was mentioning how, about this, the Harding Phillips letters. And I said, you're on your own with this. And I had two women in the front row taking notes. He said, what name you said was, where can we get those letters? And I laughed at it. And darn if that same thing didn't happen a couple years ago in place I was in. People taking notes, they're going to go home and check them out. If you do, you're on your own, because I'm not going to go into them, because we can get in all sorts of trouble here. These are family libraries, after all, as they rightfully should be. But at any rate, the affair went on 15 years. It became an issue at the Republican National Convention in 1920 when Harding was nominated. He was asked by the committee, did he have anything to hide? He thought about it for 10 minutes. So I said, no, I don't have anything to hide. Obviously he did, because the affair was exposed. The Phillipses, Jim and Carrie, took a payoff and were put, as this one source I read said, on a slow boat to Japan. Get them out of there. Carrie Phillips later died a senile pauper because they lost their money in the Depression. While this is going on, Harding's carrying off another woman too, a much younger woman, 30 years younger than he is, named Nan Britton. Nan Britton had known him back in Ohio when he was senator. She was a high school student. She had a high school crush on him. You know how you hear young girls will hang all sorts of pictures of rock stars or movie stars in their rooms? She papered her room with pictures of Warren Harding. She was an obsessed fan, so to speak. She had asked for his help in getting a secretarial job. That's kind of where this began, because this one source I used to prepare for this program said, and I quote, "She expressed her gratitude in a couch in his hotel room on this particular date in 1917. So began an affair which continued until his death. He fathered a child with her, and DNA evidence proved this in 2014 from Descendants. He fathered a child out of wedlock. He sent payments for child support through Secret Service agents. An affair continued in the White House in a 5x5 antechamber off his office. So they're continuing the affair in a closet. And she talked about this. This is documented. This isn't just hearsay. She wrote a book in 1927, which is a tell-all expose, which sold 90,000 copies. As 1932, she's actually living here in Illinois, in the city of Evanston, with her daughter. Later lived in California, and one of the seamiest examples of presidential relationships, without question, is Warren Harding. And like I say, you're on your own with that one. Another affair from a much better president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had an affair with Lucy Mercer, which continued for over a quarter of a century. The affair began in the late teens when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and that was a thing to be in around the turn of the century. Assistant Secretary of the Navy was a position you wanted because that meant you were going places. That was a kind of a position that had even more pull than the Secretary of the Navy. So Teddy Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary, FDR was, and that was a prime position. If you were Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that meant you're on the way up. He contracted polio in 1921, and it hounded him for the rest of his life. He could barely walk. One of the great cover-ups in American history was how the American media knew that Franklin Delano Roosevelt wore heavy braces, could barely walk, had to be lifted into wheelchairs, into cars, and never told the American public about it. Most people had no idea. And that's one of the great cover-ups that you would never, ever, ever see today. Eleanor had actually hired Lucy as her social secretary in 1913. She learned of the affair in 1918, threatened divorce. Many people say the marriage was never the same after that. The FDR paid for it forever, although Eleanor did take a very active role in nursing him back to health as best as possible. Lucy Mercer, for her part, married an older widower in 1920. Although she kept in contact and the affair resumed later on, she frequently visited the White House and Eleanor was not there. FDR sent a White House card to bring Lucy to each one of his 4 inaugurations. So it's going on for a long, long time. One writer said that one reason that Lucy was important to him is she listened to him, never judged him, and was not as hard on him as Eleanor was. Because Eleanor Roosevelt's a remarkable first lady. A rather unusual personality. And I might say that many people speculated that Eleanor Roosevelt was carrying on affairs of her own. Some people say with men, in particular Secretary Joseph. Some people say with women, that she was a lesbian. Again, a lot of this is speculative. Lucy was actually at Warm Springs, his southern retreat, on the day he died, on April 12th, 1945. She was spirited away before Eleanor arrived. FDR and Eleanor had a very distant marriage for all their mutual respect, for all their many accomplishments, and there were many of them. She ranks as one of the elite first ladies. But he was alone for many crucial moments. He spent most time in his wheelchair, which makes it rather more poignant. He was actually, when the U.S. received word of the Pearl Harbor attack, when the attack made its way back to mainland, it was early afternoon in the Eastern Central time zones. He was alone for most of that day. Now think about that. You have a crippled man running the country, not in good health, alone for most of the day, knowing you're going into a war. Many cases, he ate leftovers alone in the White House kitchen. That was his dinner. He'd come back from the office. It would be late. He'd be sitting in the White House kitchen alone, eating leftovers. Cook was rather mean to him. She was very loyal to Eleanor, and anything he wanted, if he wanted asparagus or whatever, she told him, no, we don't have any asparagus here. There's nothing out in Washington. She wouldn't make things he wanted. but it's very unusual for the White House staff, who usually waits on the president hand and foot, will run all over town to get whatever they want. Very unusual there. But again, FDR is alone for most of the time. It's a very sobering portrait, again, of he's a very cold individual, not a particularly likable individual. Harry Truman and others talk about how icy cold he was, but he was also a crippled individual who was dealing with a lot of different things. And it's a very sobering portrait thinking of him sitting in a wheelchair alone in some of the darkest moments in American history. I'm talking very brief about another unhappy marriage. We'll talk about a couple first ladies, a couple marriages, and I think we're going to be done for the night. If you're all hanging with me, it's going to run a little longer than an hour. Hope you're okay. Hannah, you okay over there? You okay? I don't mean to keep you here. Hannah's working overtime to help me with this. So, and I'm sure, I know Taylor's working overtime too. So thank you, Taylor. Appreciate it.
Fine, it's been a good day.
You okay there?
Yep.
Okay. One happy marriage I'll talk about very briefly is Franklin Pierce, the 14th president. His wife was a semi-invalid. Their only son, Benny, was killed at the age of 12 in a train accident just weeks before he was inaugurated. They're riding a train in Massachusetts when a passenger car broke free, rolled down an embankment. The only fatality in the crash was their son. Pierce tried to shield his wife from the son's body, but she saw it anyway. She never recovered, and she resented Pierce's ambitions. She actually blamed his ambitions, their own ambitions, for the death of their son. She wrote letters to her dead son. The marriage was rocky to begin with. It really ruined it. Pierce began to drink heavily. He drank heavily and began to drink even more after the death of his son and his isolation from Jane, his wife. So, well, again, another case where the White House was a miserable place for the president and his first lady. And that happened a number of different times. The White House is not a happy place or a joyous place or a glorious place for a number of our chief executives. The personality of the first ladies are very unusual. We like to think of our first ladies as dignified, demure, and supportive. Think about Jacqueline Kennedy in her televised White House tour in 1962, how she led the TV host around saying, "Oh, yes, you know, we're talking about this piece. What a beautiful piece we have. Oh, yes." You know, how breathless she was, very quiet. Many first ladies are not like this. They are strong-willed, headstrong, sometimes bossy. Many are from wealthy, powerful families. A few have careers of their own. Lou Henry Hoover was into geology. Hillary Clinton is a good example, a more recent one. Many are ambitious, driven, highly intelligent, well-educated, worldly. I wonder why some like Mary Todd are judged so harshly, because these are very strong personalities. They aren't the nicest, sweetest lot of people. We mentioned Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy smoked and had a very biting sense of humor. I did this talk 3 or 4 times in Missouri. I mentioned 2018. In Sullivan, Missouri, one night, I was fortunate enough to have a former Secret Service agent, if you can imagine, some audience. And he said with Jacqueline Kennedy, you couldn't stand to be in her private quarters because it was so smoked up, because she smokes so heavy. Now, when I make that comment about the first ladies, I've actually had 2 members of my audience, one in Orland Park, one in Glen Carbon, about 4 years ago, I did this. Tell me, but isn't that sexist? You know, why aren't you being hard on the men? Why are you saying about the women? Well, the first thing I thought of, because they mentioned it afterward, I thought, geez, did you hear what I was saying? I mean, I've ripped the men up and down different times. You know, we talked about men running around, drinking, imposing their will on people. Presidents are not a nice lot of people. There are only a handful of presidents I would actually like to meet and say would like personally, be a better way to put it. I don't think presidents are nice guys. There's only a handful of presidents I think were truly decent men. I think that doesn't mean they didn't love the country, didn't accomplish great things and make the world better for us and everyone else. But as far as being nice guys, you know, I get tired when I hear that one reason people will vote for a president because they think they could drink a beer with them. Is there a dumber reason to vote for a president than someone you like to drink a beer with? I don't drink at all. I wouldn't drink a soda with some of these people. I mean, I just think that's silly. But, you know, that doesn't mean the first ladies are nice women either. Do first ladies represent country? Well, in many cases, yes, absolutely. Are there many things that are admired about them? You bet there are. Many, many things. But let's not make it out to be something they're not, because that's just not accurate. And I think it sells them short. I don't think they'd like to be remembered that way either, because they have many attributes that help get them where they are. And that make niceness and sweetness isn't always one of them. And as it shouldn't be. I don't think they should be expected to be that way. 2 examples of headstrong first ladies are were married to two of the most decent men to ever hold the office. I don't think there are a lot of really nice guys who were president, but I think two of the most decent to ever hold the position were William McKinley and William Hart Taft. Nellie Taft had lived in the Rutherford Hayes White House for several months as a teenager, served as a hostess when needed, helped out Lucy Hayes, and completely fell in love with the place, made it her life's mission to get back there. She was determined to get back there somehow. She told her girlfriend she would not marry a man not destined to be president. Think about that for a life goal. Not going to marry senator, not going to marry cabinet member. I'm holding out for the president. That takes some gumption. Very quick, I'll tell you a story. William Howard Taft was friends with Teddy Roosevelt until they fell out in 1912 when Taft was running for. Actually, when Taft took over in 1908, Teddy got mad that Taft was pulling back some of his policies, but they were very close friends up until then. So Teddy Roosevelt sitting around in White House with William and Nellie Taft, and he's kind of joking around and saying, "I'm going to pretend to be a clairvoyant. I see a large man," meaning William Howard Taft. He could be a number of different things. He could be the president or chief justice of the Supreme Court. What will he be? William Howard Taft said, "Make it the chief justiceship." Nellie said, "Make it the presidency." As it had turned out, she had a stroke and was ill for much of the term, but on the last day in office, she wandered the halls, trying to stretch out every second she could. She didn't want to go. Tried to stretch out as much as she could, just wandered around. William Hart Taft was for his part, he got blown out of the 1912 re-election campaign. He only got eight electoral votes, which is the poorest showing for any incumbent we ever had. Said, "I'm glad to be going. This is the loneliest place in the world." So he was happy to be gone. He later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, served from 1921 to 1930 and loved every minute of it. Several first ladies made it clear they didn't want to leave. But many of the husbands were not sorry to be going because, like William Hart Taft, they saw it as a very lonely, very stressful place. Then you have the McKinleys. Ida McKinley was from a good family in Canton, Ohio, but was very spoiled. Very prickly personality. She hated to lose if she were playing cards with her husband. He would have to invariably drop a card or show his hand to let her win because she just would pitch a little fit if she didn't win. She had temper, a very sharp tongue. She suffered greatly from the loss of her two children and her mother, and that is very tragic. She developed epilepsy and was totally dependent on William. She is prone to seizures, and if she'd have a seizure in public, like say a state dinner, he would gently place a napkin over her face to hide the contortions and go on as if nothing happened. He would carry her around. He'd find time to go to the living quarters several times a day to visit her, take time out of his office day, his work day. He's fighting the Spanish-American War, among other things, in his presidency. Extremely devoted husband. Mark Hanna, who's a close friend who ran his presidential campaigns, a powerful senator from Ohio, said that President McKinley's made it pretty hard for the rest of us husbands here in Washington because of the way he was, and he was judged for that. One female witness said that the McKinley romance was one of the rare and beautiful things that live only in tradition. And it's lovely to think about. It really is. And it says the decency of William McKinley. There's only one president, though, who was actually married in the White House, in the White House itself, and that was Grover Cleveland, who was married on June 2nd, 1886, to Frances Folsom, who had been the daughter of a close friend from Buffalo. Cleveland was a big figure in Buffalo. He'd been a successful lawyer, a mayor, the governor of New York. I'm just watching our lights go out in the library because it's closing time here. So thank you, Hannah, once again. So he's a big figure in Buffalo. There's quite an age difference between him and Frances. He's 49, she's 21. I'm of the opinion that two adults really care about each other, the age should not really matter. But what makes this really weird is he had known her since birth. She climbed upon his knee. He bought her first baby carriage. So this is really kind of unusual, I would say. He apparently fell in love with her when she was a senior at Wells, a very exclusive school in the East. She visited the White House in her senior year with her mother, and many people thought Cleveland was actually interested in her mother, Emma, rather than Frances. He proposed to Frances by letter. She accepted by letter, a little unusual and rather formal there, while her and her mother were on a 9-month European excursion. She got back just 6 days before her wedding. They are married in the Blue Room from close family and friends. She became a media sensation, the darling of the nation. The White House staff was completely enamored with her. She wasn't as demure as you might think either. When Cleveland lost his re-election bid in 1888, she told the staff, and I quote, "I want to find everything just as it is when we come back again. We're coming back 4 years from today." And she called it, because as it was, Cleveland won his way back to the presidency in 1893. The only president served non-consecutive terms. He's, along with FDR, one of only 2 presidents to win the popular vote 3 straight times. He won it outright in 1884. 1888 was an electoral college year. So Benjamin Harrison got in, even though he did not win the popular vote. Harrison and Cleveland were matched again in 1892. Cleveland beat them straight up to win the popular vote 3 straight years, 3 straight elections. Cleveland's had 4 children, first of which was Ruth. Many people believe that is a namesake for the candy bar Baby Ruth. That's debated, but many people believe that Ruth Cleveland is who the candy bar Baby Ruth is named for. One thing they dealt with in the White House, and I'll digress a little bit here, we see the White House is very palatial today. But in the mid-late 1800s, it was not the nicest place to live. One of the reasons, it was overrun by rats. Place was just teeming with rats. Francis Cleveland found one in a bird cage. They'd be running around on tables, doing whatever. Hannah's just, I got Hannah over here just rolling her eyes at all the rats in the White House. Other hazards of the White House, I've heard that the place was overrun by spiders. Apparently the white comes to the White House when as day turned to night would become almost black with all the spiders climbing up them. The place had millions of spiders. There are packs of mangy dogs who wander the grounds. There's a horrible smell of sewer gas in the White House at the turn of the century. So many first ladies have redone the place, and obviously you can see why. One guy that remarried there are 2 presidents, and this will be the last thing we talk about tonight. 2 presidents have lost their wives and then remarried, all while in office. So that's kind of a whirlwind. And one of those was John Tyler. We mentioned him a few minutes ago, the guy whose grandkids still exist 175 years later, unfortunately. He took over for William Henry Harrison a month into office in 1841. Harrison only survived 31 days of his term. Tyler's wife, Letitia, had a stroke in 1839 that left her an invalid. She only came downstairs to the White House once to attend her daughter's wedding. She spent her entire White House existence on the 2nd floor. She suffered a 2nd stroke and died in September of 1842. Well, along the way somewhere, Tyler met Julia Gardner, who was the daughter of a wealthy New York ex-state senator from New York. She had appeared in an advertisement for apparel, was known as the Rose of Long Island, which is kind of scandalous at the time, apparently. She was 30 years younger than Tyler was, but he apparently flirted with her openly, even while his first wife was still alive. At one point, Julia Gardner had some type of affair with Tyler's son, but apparently Tyler had his fix on her. He openly flirted with her around the time. I guess one time he chased her around a room or something, much to her sister's amazement. Just kind of stupid stuff, really. I mean, these are adults here. He was married at the time. They married Julia on June 26, 1844, 2 years after his first wife had died. He was 54, she was 24. He kept on having children with Julia, as we discussed earlier. He was fathering children with her as up to the age of 70. She kept on flirting, even with the new Secretary of State. He talked later how flirty the president's wife was with him. She wasn't humble, to put it mildly. The things she wrote about herself, she was completely stuck on herself, really was. I've seen the portrait paintings of Julia Tyler. I don't think she's that much to look at, but she obviously thought she was. And if you take a look at it, you can see whatever your opinion was, but she wasn't humble, let's put it that way. The other situation where a president lost his wife and then remarried through his administration was Woodrow Wilson. Very highly celebrated remarriage. Before the White House, Wilson had been the president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910, where among his faculty members was Grover Cleveland, where he taught after leaving the White House. Wilson had been the governor of New Jersey at one point. He was Southern born, has been accused of white supremacy, which based on things I've read about him, I think is very true. Very much intellectual. Comes across as cold, but was very much into the women in his life. Very devoted to his wife and the 3 daughters they had. His wife was named Ellen. his first wife. They were married for 29 years. She is reticent, not a big personality. She's very charity-minded, very artistic, I should say. The union produced 3 daughters, and like I say, Wilson, what you read about Wilson is he just very much loved the women in his life, very, very devoted to his wife and daughters. Ellen died on August 6, 1914, 17 months into his term, and Wilson was despondent. He could barely go on. I guess privately told friends he hoped he'd be assassinated because he just couldn't face life without Ellen. But a few months later, he's riding with a friend of his who's a doctor. They see this woman walking down the street, and Wilson says, "Who is that beautiful lady?" His doctor friend is kind of surprised because, he's been despondent for so long. The woman was Edith Galt, a widow of a jeweler who drove her own car, supposedly the first woman in the District of Columbia to drive her own car. A meeting was arranged at the White House between the president and Ms. Galt, and so began an intense courtship. He'd write long, passionate letters to her, which were hand-delivered, just as he'd done with his first wife. The letters are extremely sensual. They describe intimacy in very flowery detail. Unlike Harding's filthy, trashy letters, these are just over-the-top romantic. I've read some of these letters, and again, you're on your own with these, but they're of different tone than Harding. Wilson was very romantic, very debonair romantic at heart. A very interesting psychological specimen there. So if you get a chance to look at those letters, that's kind of a story in itself. Oddly, the intensity of his love for Edith may have distracted him from tasks at hand, such as the bombing of the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915, tensions with Britain and Germany, which were continuing before the U.S. entered World War I. He apparently flubbed an appearance in Philadelphia that was tribute to being distracted by his love interest. An article by H.W. Brands, who's a well-respected professor at Texas. You see him on History Channel quite a bit, tall, thin, dark-haired guy. He wrote an article in 2013 that details this, how Wilson was actually distracted from the serious matters at hand by being in love. He married Edith on December 18th, 1915, at her home in Washington in front of 40 relatives and friends. If you ever get a chance, David O. Selznick, who produced Gone with the Wind, in 1944 did a movie on Woodrow Wilson. It's about a 3-hour movie. It's in color. The color's gorgeous, and if you can see it, it's really something to see. The movie's a bust. I think Selznick lost $3 million, which is quite a bit of some money back then, certainly. The movie doesn't really portray the wedding very accurately. It looks more like a state wedding. Truthfully, it was a very small ceremony in front of 40 family friends at her house. But Wilson and Edith had a lot of things in common. They played golf together. They rode in cars. They both were like that. They became inseparable companions. Edith filled one of the unusual roles of any first lady after he suffered a debilitating stroke in September of 1919. So the last 18 months or so of the presidency, he was an invalid. She was in the de facto president. She was been called a secret president. She handled many executive duties. He versed her in policy and on many fronts. She ran interference in state matters. She ran interference on visitors for the rest of the presidency. So that was a situation where First Lady, in many ways, was a president. We're running low overtime. That's usually about what I cover in these talks. So I'll conclude by saying about presidential marriages and romances, they can't all be summarized in the same way. We're talking about different individuals, both husbands and wives. Were some of them close? Absolutely, but not all of them. They aren't perfect people, and we can't make them out to be. They have flaws, some more so than others, and that applies to both the men and the women. Some of their actions are dignified, others are clandestine, and in some cases are raunchy. They're a highly fascinating group to study and talk about and learn about. I've studied presidents extensively. One of my favorite things to say about it is their personal lives. It really tells you something about the type of people who've led our country and have influenced it. And I'm happy to take any questions you have. Before I take questions, I'd like to thank you for having me tonight. Thank you, Taylor, for inviting me too. I hope you all enjoyed this. I hope you all stayed with me. I didn't put you to sleep early tonight. So if you got any questions, Taylor will field them for us.
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask them now. I did have one question. So
Please
when
do.
I visited the Lincoln home in Springfield several
Yes.
years ago, I
Yep.
noticed that Mary and Abraham had different rooms. Was that more of a societal standing thing, or was that speaking more to the tumultuousness?
It was more of a societal thing. It was not unusual for people in position to have separate rooms. They were quite close, and I don't mean to speak out of turn. They they enjoyed all parts of their marriage, so to speak. But and she wrote about that rather in Victorian prose at the time. But no, that was more of a societal thing. That really does not indicate the closeness of that marriage. That's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. I've talked about some people before. I'm glad you asked that.
All right. Then do we have any other questions? If not, then I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. And thank you so much for joining us. That was a very interesting talk.
Hey, thanks for having me, everyone. If you ever need me back, I'll be happy to be there. Maybe in person someday.
Hopefully soon, yes.
Yes. But thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.